The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. The judge, a stern-looking man with sharp features and a reputation for being no-nonsense, sat high on his bench, his eyes scanning the room. He had seen it all, decades of cases, big and small, and he prided himself on being fair but firm. Today, however, something felt different. The case before him seemed simple enough. A young couple, barely in their 20s, was being sued by their landlord for unpaid rent and property damage. The landlord claimed they had trashed the place and left without a word. The couple, dressed in simple clothes, sat quietly, their heads slightly bowed, as if they were already expecting the worst. The judge glanced at the paperwork in front of him. The landlord's lawyer had painted a clear picture: irresponsible tenants who had taken advantage of a kind property owner. The evidence seemed solid: photographs of a messy apartment, unpaid rent notices, and a broken lease agreement. The judge sighed. He had seen this kind of thing too many times before. He looked at the young couple, his expression hardening. "Do you have anything to say for yourselves?" he asked, his voice cold and dismissive. The young man, tall and thin, stood up slowly. He looked nervous, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. "Your Honor," he began, his voice soft but steady, "we didn't do what they're saying. We paid the rent on time, every time. And we didn't damage the apartment. We left it clean, just like we found it." The judge raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "That's not what the evidence suggests," he said, tapping the photographs on his desk. "These pictures tell a different story. Do you have any proof to back up your claims?" The young woman, sitting beside her partner, spoke up for the first time. Her voice was quiet but firm. "Your Honor, we don't have much, but we have our word. We're not the kind of people who would do something like this. We've worked hard for everything we have, and we wouldn't throw it away like that." The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "Your word," he repeated, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "That's all you have? No receipts, no witnesses, just your word?" He shook his head, clearly unimpressed. "I've heard this kind of story before. Young people who think they can get away with anything, who think the rules don't apply to them. Well, let me tell you something, they do." The young couple exchanged a glance, their faces filled with a mix of frustration and helplessness. They knew they were telling the truth, but they also knew how it looked. They didn't have money for a fancy lawyer, and they didn't have the kind of evidence the court demanded. All they had was their honesty, and right now, that didn't seem to be enough. The judge leaned forward, his voice sharp. "I've heard enough. It's clear to me that you're not taking this seriously. You've caused significant damage to someone else's property, and you've shown no remorse. I'm ordering you to pay the full amount claimed by the landlord, plus court fees. And if you can't pay, there will be consequences." The young man's shoulders slumped, and the young woman's eyes filled with tears. They had hoped for a fair hearing, but it seemed like the odds were stacked against them. As they stood to leave, the judge added one final comment, his tone dripping with disdain. "Maybe this will teach you to take responsibility for your actions. You can't just expect to get away with things because you're young." The couple walked out of the courtroom, their heads down, their hearts heavy. They didn't know what to do next. They didn't have the money to pay the judgment, and they didn't know where to turn. But as they stepped outside into the bright sunlight, something inside them shifted. They knew they couldn't give up. They knew they had to fight, not just for themselves, but for the truth. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, the judge was preparing to move on to the next case. He didn't think much about the young couple, he had seen too many like them to dwell on it. But as he glanced at the paperwork one last time, something caught his eye. A small detail he had missed before. A date on one of the rent receipts didn't match up with the landlord's claims. It was a small thing, but it made him pause. He frowned, his mind racing. Could there be more to this story than he had realized? He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. He had made his decision, and he wasn't one to second-guess himself. But as the day went on, the thought kept nagging at him. That small discrepancy, that tiny detail, wouldn't let him go. By the time he left the courthouse that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that he might have made a mistake. The young couple, meanwhile, had decided to take matters into their own hands. They knew they couldn't afford a lawyer, but they also knew they couldn't just accept the judge's ruling. They started gathering whatever evidence they could find, old text messages, bank statements, anything that might prove their innocence. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They also reached out to a local community organization that helped people in their situation. It was a long shot, but they were willing to try anything. As they worked late into the night, going through every piece of paper they could find, they began to piece together a different story. A story that didn't match the one the landlord had told in court. A story that, if they could prove it, might just change everything. The judge, meanwhile, couldn't sleep. That small detail kept playing over and over in his mind. He knew he should let it go, but something about it felt off. He had always prided himself on being fair, on making sure justice was served. But what if, just this once, he had gotten it wrong? What if he had been too quick to judge, too quick to dismiss the young couple's claims? The next morning, he arrived at the courthouse early, his mind still racing. He pulled out the case file and started going through it again, more carefully this time. As he did, more inconsistencies began to emerge. Dates that didn't add up, receipts that didn't match, statements that contradicted each other. The more he looked, the more he realized that something wasn't right. By the time the young couple arrived at the community organization's office later that day, they had no idea that the judge was starting to question his own decision. They were focused on their own fight, on proving their innocence. But as they sat down with the organization's lawyer, they began to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The judge, meanwhile, was starting to feel a sense of unease. He had always believed in the system, in the idea that justice would prevail. But now, for the first time in his career, he was starting to wonder if the system had failed. And if it had, what did that mean for him? For the young couple? For the idea of justice itself? As the day wore on, the judge found himself thinking more and more about the young couple. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been too harsh, too quick to judge. He knew he had a reputation for being tough, but he had always believed it was for the right reasons. Now, he wasn't so sure. The young couple, meanwhile, were starting to feel a sense of determination. They knew the road ahead would be hard, but they also knew they couldn't give up. They had to fight, not just for themselves, but for the truth. And as they left the community organization's office that evening, they felt a sense of hope they hadn't felt in a long time. The judge, on the other hand, was feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: doubt. He knew he had a decision to make, and he knew it wouldn't be easy. But he also knew that if he didn't do something, he might never be able to live with himself. As the sun set that evening, both the judge and the young couple found themselves at a crossroads. The judge, grappling with his own conscience, and the young couple, fighting for their future. Their paths had crossed in that courtroom, and now, their fates were intertwined in ways they couldn't yet imagine. And as the night deepened, one thing became clear: this story was far from over. The next morning, the judge arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. His desk was cluttered with the case file of the young couple, now filled with notes and highlighted sections where inconsistencies had caught his attention. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been too quick to judge, too quick to dismiss their claims. For the first time in years, he felt a pang of guilt. He had always prided himself on being fair. But now he wondered if he had let his own biases cloud his judgment. He decided to dig deeper. He called in his clerk, a young woman who had been working with him for a few years. "I need you to pull up everything you can find on this case," he said, handing her the file. "I want to see every document, every piece of evidence, no matter how small. And I need it by the end of the day." The clerk nodded, sensing the urgency in his voice. She had never seen him like this before. Usually, he was so confident, so sure of himself. But now, he seemed almost uncertain. She took the file and got to work, determined to help him find whatever he was looking for. Meanwhile, the young couple was busy preparing their own case. They had spent the previous night gathering every piece of evidence they could find: old text messages, bank statements, even a few photos they had taken when they moved out of the apartment. They knew it wasn't much, but it was all they had. They met with the lawyer from the community organization, a kind but no-nonsense woman who had seen her fair share of tough cases. "This is going to be an uphill battle," the lawyer warned them. "The judge has already made his decision, and it's not easy to get him to change his mind. But if we can find enough evidence to prove your innocence, we might have a shot." The young couple nodded, their determination unwavering. They knew the odds were against them, but they also knew they had to try. They couldn't let the landlord's lies ruin their lives. Back at the courthouse, the judge was growing more and more uneasy as he reviewed the evidence. The more he looked, the more inconsistencies he found. Dates that didn't match up, receipts that seemed forged, and statements that contradicted each other. It was as if the landlord's case was built on a house of cards, and the slightest breeze could bring it all crashing down. By midday, the clerk returned with a stack of documents. "I found a few things you might want to see," she said, placing the papers on his desk. "There's a discrepancy in the dates on the rent receipts, and some of the photos the landlord submitted don't match the timeline he provided. Also, I found a witness who might be willing to testify on behalf of the couple." The judge's eyes widened. "A witness? Who?" "A neighbor," the clerk explained. "She said she saw the landlord entering the apartment after the couple had moved out. She also said the apartment was in good condition when they left." The judge leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This changed everything. If the neighbor's testimony was true, it meant the landlord had lied under oath. It meant the young couple had been telling the truth all along. And it meant he had made a terrible mistake. He knew he had to act quickly. He called the landlord's lawyer and requested a meeting. When the lawyer arrived, the judge didn't mince words. "I've found some inconsistencies in your client's case," he said, his voice stern. "If these discrepancies are not resolved, I will have no choice but to reopen the case and reconsider my decision." The lawyer looked nervous but tried to remain composed. "Your Honor, I assure you, my client's case is solid. These so-called inconsistencies are likely just misunderstandings." The judge wasn't convinced. "Misunderstandings or not, I need to see proof. I want your client to provide all original documents, including bank statements, receipts, and any other evidence related to this case. And I want it by tomorrow." The lawyer nodded, though it was clear he wasn't happy about it. He left the courthouse, no doubt to inform his client of the judge's demands. That evening, the young couple met with their lawyer again. They had spent the entire day gathering more evidence, and they were exhausted but hopeful. The lawyer reviewed everything they had found and nodded approvingly. "This is good," she said. "If we can present this to the judge, along with the witness testimony, we might have a chance." The young woman sighed, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Do you really think he'll listen to us? After the way he treated us in court?" The lawyer smiled gently. "Judges are human too. They make mistakes. And when they realize they've made one, they usually try to fix it. We just have to give him a reason to reconsider." The young man nodded, his determination unwavering. "We'll do whatever it takes. We can't let this go." The next day, the judge arrived at the courthouse early again, his mind still racing. He had spent the night thinking about the case, about the young couple, and about his own role in all of this. He knew he had a responsibility to ensure justice was served, and he was determined to make things right. The landlord's lawyer arrived shortly after, carrying a stack of documents. He placed them on the judge's desk, his expression tense. "Here's everything you asked for, Your Honor," he said. "I hope this clears up any misunderstandings." The judge nodded, though he wasn't convinced. He spent the next few hours going through the documents, comparing them to the evidence he had already seen. The more he looked, the more convinced he became that something was wrong. The dates still didn't match up, and some of the receipts looked suspiciously altered. Finally, he made a decision. He called the young couple's lawyer and requested a meeting. When they arrived, he didn't waste any time. "I've reviewed the evidence," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "And I believe there may have been a mistake in my initial ruling. I'm reopening the case and will hear your arguments again." The young couple's eyes widened in surprise, but they quickly nodded, their hope renewed. They knew this was their chance to prove their innocence, and they weren't going to waste it. The judge scheduled a new hearing for the following week, giving both sides time to prepare. As the young couple left the courthouse, they felt a sense of relief they hadn't felt in weeks. They knew the fight wasn't over, but they also knew they had a chance. And for now, that was enough. The judge, meanwhile, felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He knew he had made a mistake, but he also knew he was doing the right thing by trying to fix it. He just hoped it wasn't too late. As the days passed, both sides prepared for the new hearing. The young couple worked tirelessly with their lawyer, gathering every piece of evidence they could find. The landlord, on the other hand, seemed nervous, his lawyer scrambling to explain the inconsistencies in their case. When the day of the hearing finally arrived, the courtroom was tense. The young couple sat quietly, their hands clasped tightly together. The judge entered, his expression serious but not unkind. He knew this was a pivotal moment, not just for the young couple, but for himself as well. As the hearing began, the young couple's lawyer presented their case, laying out the evidence piece by piece. The witness, the neighbor, testified on their behalf, her words clear and unwavering. The landlord's lawyer tried to counter, but the inconsistencies in their case were too glaring to ignore. By the end of the hearing, it was clear where the truth lay. The judge took a deep breath, his decision weighing heavily on him. He knew what he had to do, but he also knew it wouldn't be easy. As he prepared to deliver his ruling, the young couple held their breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had come so far, fought so hard. And now, it all came down to this. The judge looked at them, his expression softening for the first time. After reviewing all the evidence, he began, his voice steady, "I have come to the conclusion that my initial ruling was incorrect. The evidence presented by the defense is compelling, and it is clear that there were significant inconsistencies in the plaintiff's case. Therefore, I am overturning my previous decision and ruling in favor of the defendants." The young couple's eyes filled with tears, their relief palpable. They had fought for the truth, and finally, justice had been served. The judge, meanwhile, felt a sense of closure. He knew he had made a mistake, but he also knew he had done the right thing by correcting it. And as he watched the young couple leave the courtroom, their heads held high, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had shown him the importance of humility, of admitting when you're wrong, and of fighting for what's right. And as he left the courthouse that evening, he knew he would carry that lesson with him for the rest of his life. The days following the judge's decision were a whirlwind for the young couple. They felt a mix of relief, gratitude, and exhaustion. The weight of the lawsuit had been lifted, but the emotional toll it had taken on them was still fresh. They knew they had been lucky to have found a lawyer who believed in them, lucky to have a witness who was willing to speak up, and lucky that the judge had been willing to reconsider his decision. But they also knew that their fight wasn't entirely over. The landlord, though defeated in court, still had a presence in their lives, and the experience had left them wary of trusting others. The couple decided to take some time to regroup. They spent a few days resting, catching up on sleep, and processing everything that had happened. They talked for hours, reflecting on the ordeal and what it had taught them. They realized how important it was to stand up for themselves, even when the odds seemed impossible. They also realized how much they had relied on each other during the toughest moments. Their bond had grown stronger, and they felt ready to face whatever came next. Meanwhile, the judge was also reflecting on the case. It had been a wake-up call for him, a reminder that even someone with decades of experience could make mistakes. He had always prided himself on being fair and impartial, but the case had shown him that he wasn't immune to bias. He knew he needed to do better, not just for himself, but for the people who came before him in court. He decided to take a closer look at his own practices, to question his assumptions, and to approach each case with a more open mind. A week after the ruling, the young couple received a letter in the mail. It was from the courthouse, and their hearts sank as they opened it, fearing it might be bad news. But to their surprise, it was an invitation. The judge wanted to meet with them, not in court, but in his office. The letter was brief and formal, but it carried a tone of respect. They weren't sure what to make of it, but they decided to go. After everything they had been through, they felt they owed it to themselves to hear what he had to say. On the day of the meeting, the couple arrived at the courthouse early. They were nervous, unsure of what to expect. The judge's clerk greeted them warmly and led them to his office. When they walked in, the judge stood up from his desk and gestured for them to sit. His demeanor was different from the last time they had seen him, less stern, more approachable. He looked at them with a mix of respect and humility. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice calm and measured. "I wanted to speak with you both personally, to apologize for how I handled your case initially. I was wrong to dismiss your claim so quickly, and I regret the way I spoke to you in court. It was unprofessional, and it was unfair." The young couple exchanged a glance, surprised by his words. They hadn't expected an apology, let alone one so sincere. The young woman spoke first, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you, Your Honor. That means a lot to us. It wasn't easy, but we're glad the truth came out in the end." The judge nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The truth is important," he said. "And so is fairness. I've been doing this job for a long time, and I've always believed in the system. But your case made me realize that the system isn't perfect. It's only as good as the people who uphold it. And sometimes, those people, myself included, make mistakes." The young man leaned forward, his eyes meeting the judge's. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is what we do after. You could have ignored the inconsistencies and stuck with your decision. But you didn't. You took the time to look again, and that made all the difference." The judge smiled faintly, appreciating the young man's perspective. "You're right," he said. "And I'm grateful for the lesson. I hope I can carry it forward and be a better judge because of it." The conversation continued for a while, with the judge asking the couple about their plans for the future and offering advice on how to protect themselves from similar situations. He even recommended a few resources that could help them as they moved forward. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. What had started as a tense and uncertain encounter had turned into a meaningful exchange of mutual respect. As the couple left the courthouse, they felt a sense of closure they hadn't expected. The judge's apology had been unexpected, but it had also been healing. They realized that the experience, as difficult as it had been, had taught them valuable lessons about resilience, justice, and the importance of standing up for what's right. In the weeks that followed, the couple focused on rebuilding their lives. They found a new apartment, one with a landlord who came highly recommended by the community organization that had helped them. They also took steps to protect themselves legally, keeping detailed records of all their interactions and agreements. They knew they couldn't control everything, but they felt more prepared to handle whatever challenges might come their way. The judge, too, made changes in his own life. He started taking more time to review cases, paying closer attention to details and questioning his own assumptions. He also began mentoring younger judges and lawyers, sharing the lessons he had learned from the case. He wanted to make sure that others in the legal system understood the importance of humility and fairness. One day, several months after the case had ended, the judge received a letter from the young couple. It was a simple note, thanking him for his apology and for taking the time to meet with them. They wrote about how the experience had changed them, how it had made them stronger and more determined to fight for justice in their own lives. They also expressed their hope that the judge would continue to approach his work with the same openness and humility he had shown them. The judge read the letter several times, each word resonating deeply with him. He felt a sense of pride, not in himself, but in the couple. They had faced a difficult situation with grace and determination, and they had come out stronger on the other side. He knew their story would stay with him for the rest of his career, a reminder of the importance of fairness, humility, and the power of second chances. As he placed the letter in a drawer in his desk, the judge felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the legal system wasn't perfect, but he also knew it could be a force for good when approached with integrity and compassion. And he was determined to do his part to make it better, one case at a time. For the young couple, life slowly returned to normal. They still carried the lessons they had learned, but the weight of the lawsuit no longer hung over them. They felt hopeful about the future, ready to move forward with their lives. And as they looked back on everything they had been through, they knew they had come out stronger, not just as individuals, but as a team. Their story was far from over, but they were ready to face whatever came next, knowing they had the strength and resilience to overcome any challenge. And as they took their first steps into this new chapter of their lives, they did so with a sense of hope and determination, ready to write their own story, one day at a time. Life began to settle into a new rhythm for the young couple. The scars from their legal battle were still there, but they no longer felt raw. They had found a small, cozy apartment in a quiet neighborhood, and their new landlord was kind and understanding. The community organization that had helped them during the lawsuit continued to offer support, connecting them with resources and opportunities to rebuild their lives. For the first time in months, they felt like they could breathe again. One evening, as they sat together in their new living room, the young woman turned to her partner. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" she asked, her voice soft. "If we hadn't fought back, if the judge hadn't changed his mind, where would we be now?" The young man nodded, his expression thoughtful. "All the time," he admitted. "But I also think about how much stronger we are because of it. We didn't just survive, we fought back. And we won." She smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Yeah, we did. And now we're here. Together." Their moment of reflection was interrupted by a knock at the door. They exchanged a curious glance before the young man got up to answer it. Standing outside was a reporter, a woman with a friendly smile and a notebook in her hand. "Hi," she said. "I'm with the local newspaper. I heard about your case and wanted to talk to you about it. Would you be willing to share your story?" The couple hesitated. They had spent so much time trying to put the lawsuit behind them, and the idea of reliving it all over again was daunting. But after a moment, the young woman nodded. "Okay," she said. "But only if it helps someone else." The reporter smiled gratefully. "That's exactly why I'm here. Stories like yours can inspire others to stand up for themselves, even when it feels impossible." They invited the reporter inside, and over the next hour, they shared their story, every detail, from the moment they received the eviction notice to the day the judge overturned his decision. They talked about the fear, the frustration, and the moments when they felt like giving up. But they also talked about the hope, the support they had received, and the strength they had found in each other. As the reporter listened, she couldn't help but be moved by their story. "This is incredible," she said when they finished. "Your courage, your determination, it's inspiring. I think a lot of people will relate to what you've been through." The couple smiled, feeling a sense of pride they hadn't expected. They hadn't set out to be heroes, but if their story could help someone else, then it was worth sharing. A few days later, the article was published. It was titled "From Injustice to Victory: How a Young Couple Fought Back and Won." The response was overwhelming. People from all over the community reached out to the couple, thanking them for sharing their story and sharing their own experiences with injustice. Some even offered help, legal advice, job opportunities, and words of encouragement. The couple was touched by the outpouring of support. They hadn't realized how many people had faced similar struggles, and it made them feel less alone. They also realized that their fight wasn't just about them, it was about something bigger. It was about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, and about showing others that they could do the same. Meanwhile, the judge also saw the article. He had been following the couple's story with interest, and he was impressed by how they had handled everything. He decided to reach out to them again, this time with an idea. He invited them to speak at a local event about access to justice, where community leaders, lawyers, and judges would be discussing ways to make the legal system more fair and equitable. The couple was hesitant at first. They had never spoken in front of a crowd before, and the idea of sharing their story with so many people was intimidating. But after some discussion, they agreed. They knew how important it was to raise awareness about the challenges people face in the legal system, and they wanted to do their part to make a difference. The day of the event arrived, and the couple stood backstage, their nerves palpable. The judge was there too, and he could see how anxious they were. "You'll do great," he assured them. "Just speak from the heart. That's all anyone can ask for." When it was their turn to speak, the couple walked onto the stage together, holding hands for support. The room was filled with people, judges, lawyers, community activists, and ordinary citizens who cared about justice. The young woman took a deep breath and began to speak. "A few months ago, we were in a courtroom, fighting for our future," she said, her voice steady. "We were scared, and we didn't know if we would win. But we knew we had to try. Because if we didn't stand up for ourselves, who would?" The young man continued, sharing their story in detail, the challenges they had faced, the mistakes that had been made, and the lessons they had learned. He talked about the importance of fairness, of second chances, and of never giving up, even when the odds seem impossible. As they spoke, the room was silent, every person hanging on their words. When they finished, the audience erupted into applause. The couple looked out at the crowd, their hearts swelling with pride. They had done it, they had shared their story, and it had made an impact. After the event, people lined up to thank them. Some shared their own stories, while others offered words of encouragement. The judge was among them, and he shook their hands warmly. "You two are incredible," he said. "What you've been through, and how you've handled it, it's inspiring. You've reminded all of us why we do what we do." The couple smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment they hadn't expected. They had started this journey fighting for themselves, but along the way, they had become advocates for something much bigger. They had shown that even in the face of injustice, there is hope, and that with courage, determination, and a little bit of help, anyone can make a difference. As they left the event that evening, the young woman turned to her partner. "Do you think this is just the beginning?" she asked. He nodded, taking her hand. "Yeah, I do. We've got a lot more to do. But whatever comes next, we'll face it together." And with that, they walked into the night, ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. Their story was far from over, but they knew one thing for sure: they were ready to keep fighting, not just for themselves, but for everyone who needed a voice. The weeks following the event were a whirlwind for the young couple. Their story had struck a chord with so many people, and they found themselves being invited to speak at other gatherings, both locally and in neighboring towns. Each time they shared their story, they felt a little more confident, a little more empowered. They were no longer just a couple who had faced injustice, they were becoming advocates for change. One day, they received a call from a non-profit organization that focused on housing rights. The director, a warm and enthusiastic woman named Clara, had read about their case and wanted to meet with them. "We're working on a campaign to educate tenants about their rights," she explained. "And we think your story could be a powerful part of that. Would you be willing to work with us?" The couple was intrigued. They had never thought of themselves as activists, but the idea of helping others avoid the struggles they had faced was appealing. They agreed to meet with Clara and learn more about the organization's work. When they arrived at the nonprofit's office, they were greeted with open arms. Clara showed them around, introducing them to the team and explaining the various programs they ran. "We provide legal assistance, host workshops, and advocate for policy changes," she said. "But one of our biggest challenges is reaching people who don't know their rights or are afraid to speak up. That's where you come in." The couple listened intently as Clara outlined her vision. She wanted them to be the faces of a new campaign, a series of videos, workshops, and community events aimed at empowering tenants and holding landlords accountable. "Your story is powerful because it's real," she said. "It shows people that they're not alone, and that they can fight back." The young woman looked at her partner, who nodded in agreement. "We're in," she said. "If we can help even one person avoid what we went through, it'll be worth it." Over the next few weeks, the couple threw themselves into the campaign. They worked with the nonprofit's team to create videos sharing their story and offering practical advice for tenants. They also helped plan a series of workshops, where they would speak alongside lawyers and housing experts. It was a lot of work, but it felt meaningful. For the first time in a long time, they felt like they were making a real difference. The first workshop was held in a community center in their neighborhood. The room was packed with people of all ages and backgrounds, each one eager to learn about their rights. The couple stood at the front of the room, their nerves replaced by a sense of purpose. They shared their story, answered questions, and offered encouragement to those who were facing similar struggles. One woman, a single mother with 2 young children, approached them after the workshop. "I've been dealing with a terrible landlord for months," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know what to do, but hearing your story gave me hope." "Thank you." The couple smiled, their hearts swelling with pride. This was why they were doing this, to give people hope, to show them that they weren't alone. As the campaign gained momentum, the couple found themselves becoming more involved in the housing rights movement. They attended city council meetings, advocating for stronger tenant protections. They met with lawmakers, sharing their experiences and urging them to take action. They even started a social media page, where they shared resources and connected with others who were fighting for justice. Their efforts didn't go unnoticed. The local media picked up on their story again, this time focusing on their advocacy work. They were featured in newspapers, on radio shows, and even on a local TV news segment. With each interview, they felt more confident in their message, that everyone deserves a safe and fair place to live, and that no one should have to face injustice alone. One day, they received a surprising email. It was from a national housing rights organization, inviting them to speak at a conference in the state capital. The conference would bring together activists, policymakers, and community leaders from across the country to discuss solutions to the housing crisis. The couple was stunned, they had never imagined their story would reach so far. They discussed the invitation with Clara, who encouraged them to go. "This is a huge opportunity," she said. "Not just for you, but for the movement. Your voice matters, and people need to hear it." The couple agreed, and a few weeks later, they found themselves standing on a stage in front of hundreds of people. The room was filled with some of the most influential figures in the housing rights movement, and the couple felt a mix of nerves and excitement. But as they began to speak, their nerves melted away. They shared their story with passion and conviction, and the room listened intently. When they finished, the audience erupted into applause. People lined up to thank them, to share their own stories, and to offer support. The couple felt a sense of accomplishment they had never experienced before. They had started this journey fighting for themselves, but now they were part of something much bigger, a movement to create a more just and equitable world. After the conference, the couple returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. They knew their work was far from over, but they also knew they were on the right path. They continued to work with the nonprofit, planning more workshops and events. They also started mentoring other tenants who were facing similar struggles, offering advice and support. Their relationship had also grown stronger through the experience. They had faced challenges together, and they had come out stronger on the other side. They knew they could handle whatever came next, as long as they had each other. One evening, as they sat together in their living room, the young man turned to his partner. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asked. "From that courtroom to here, it's kind of amazing, isn't it?" She smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Yeah, it is. And we're just getting started." As they looked out at the city lights, they felt a sense of hope and determination. They had faced injustice and fought back, and now they were using their experience to help others. Their story was far from over, but they knew one thing for sure: they were ready to keep fighting, not just for themselves, but for everyone who needed a voice. And with that, they walked into the future, ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. Their journey had taught them the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the strength that comes from fighting together. They were no longer just a couple who had faced injustice, they were advocates, leaders, and changemakers. And they were ready to make a difference. The young couple's advocacy work continued to gain momentum, and their lives became a balancing act between their personal goals and their growing role in the housing rights movement. They were no longer just survivors of injustice, they were leaders, mentors, and voices for change. But with this new role came challenges they hadn't anticipated. The more visible they became, the more they were scrutinized. Some people praised their efforts, while others criticized them, accusing them of being too idealistic or even stirring up trouble. It was a lot to handle, but they refused to back down. One afternoon, as they were preparing for another workshop, the young woman received a call from Clara at the nonprofit. "We've got a situation," Clara said, her tone serious. "There's a landlord who's been harassing tenants in one of the buildings downtown. He's ignoring repair requests, threatening evictions, and even cutting off utilities. The tenants are scared, and they don't know what to do. I think this is something you two could help with." The couple exchanged a glance. They knew this was exactly the kind of situation they had been working to address, but it also felt like a big step. This wasn't just about sharing their story anymore, it was about stepping into the fray and taking on a powerful opponent. Still, they couldn't turn their backs on people who needed help. "We'll do it," the young man said firmly. "Tell us what we need to do." Clara explained the plan. The nonprofit would provide legal support, but the couple's role would be to meet with the tenants, help them organize, and give them the confidence to stand up for their rights. It was a delicate situation, and they would need to tread carefully to avoid escalating tensions. The next day, the couple visited the building in question. It was an old, run-down apartment complex with peeling paint and broken windows. They knocked on the door of one of the tenants, a middle-aged woman named Maria, who had reached out to the nonprofit for help. Maria welcomed them inside, her face etched with worry. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice trembling. "We don't know what to do. The landlord won't fix anything, and he's threatening to kick us out if we complain. Some of us have kids, and we can't afford to move." The couple listened as Maria and a few other tenants shared their stories. It was heartbreaking, families living in unsafe conditions, afraid to speak up for fear of retaliation. The couple knew they had to do something. Over the next few days, they worked closely with the tenants, helping them document the issues and file formal complaints with the city. They also organized a meeting to discuss their options and build solidarity among the residents. It wasn't easy, many of the tenants were scared, and some were hesitant to get involved. But the couple's calm, reassuring presence helped ease their fears. "We've been through something similar," the young woman told them during the meeting. "We know how scary it can be, but we also know that when you stand together, you're stronger. You don't have to face this alone." Her words resonated with the tenants, and slowly, they began to come together. They formed a tenants' association, elected leaders, and started planning their next steps. The couple stayed by their side, offering guidance and support every step of the way. Meanwhile, the landlord caught wind of what was happening and wasn't happy. He sent threatening letters to the tenants, warning them to stop causing trouble. But the tenants stood their ground, emboldened by the couple's support and the legal backing of the nonprofit. The situation came to a head when the city's housing inspector arrived to assess the building. The inspector found numerous violations, from broken heaters to mold infestations. The landlord was fined and ordered to make the necessary repairs. It was a victory for the tenants, but the couple knew it was just the beginning. They encouraged the tenants to stay organized and vigilant, knowing that the landlord might try to retaliate. As they left the building that evening, the couple felt a mix of emotions. They were proud of what they had accomplished, but they also knew how much work still needed to be done. They had seen firsthand how difficult it was for tenants to stand up to abusive landlords, and it made them even more determined to push for systemic change. Their work with the Tenants Association caught the attention of local lawmakers, who invited them to testify at a hearing on housing reform. The couple prepared carefully, knowing that this was their chance to make a real impact. They gathered data, stories, and recommendations, determined to show how the system was failing vulnerable tenants. On the day of the hearing, the couple walked into the Capitol building, their nerves tingling with anticipation. The room was filled with lawmakers, advocates, and reporters, all waiting to hear what they had to say. When it was their turn to speak, the young woman stepped up to the podium, her voice steady and clear. "We're here today because we believe everyone deserves a safe and fair place to live," she began. "But right now, too many people are being denied that basic right. We've seen firsthand how tenants are being exploited, intimidated, and ignored. And we've seen how hard it is for them to fight back." She went on to share their story, as well as the stories of the tenants they had helped. She talked about the need for stronger tenant protections, better enforcement of housing laws, and more resources for tenants who were facing abuse. Her words were powerful, and the room listened intently. When she finished, the young man stepped up to the podium. "This isn't just about housing," he said. "It's about justice. It's about making sure that everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from, has a fair shot at a decent life. And it's about holding people accountable when they abuse their power." Their testimony made an impact. Several lawmakers pledged to support new legislation to strengthen tenant rights, and the media coverage brought even more attention to the issue. The couple felt a sense of hope they hadn't felt in a long time. They knew change wouldn't happen overnight, but they also knew they were moving in the right direction. As they left the Capitol building that evening, the young woman turned to her partner. "Do you think we're making a difference?" she asked. He smiled, taking her hand. "Yeah, I do. It's not easy, but we're doing it. And we're not alone." Their journey had taken them further than they ever imagined, from a courtroom to a movement. They had faced challenges, setbacks, and doubts, but they had also found strength, purpose, and hope. They knew their work was far from over, but they also knew they were ready to keep fighting, not just for themselves, but for everyone who deserved a fair shot at a better life. And as they walked into the night, they felt a sense of determination that would carry them through whatever came next. Their story was still being written, and they were ready to make it one of courage, resilience, and change. The couple's testimony at the housing reform hearing marked a turning point in their advocacy work. Their story, combined with the powerful accounts of the tenants they had helped, sparked a wave of momentum for housing reform in their city. Lawmakers began drafting new legislation to strengthen tenant protections, and the media continued to shine a spotlight on the issue. The couple found themselves at the center of a growing movement, their voices amplified by the support of the community and the non-profit organizations they worked with. But with this newfound visibility came new challenges. The landlord they had helped the tenants stand up against wasn't going down without a fight. He hired a high-powered lawyer and launched a counter-campaign, accusing the couple of being troublemakers who were trying to undermine property owners' rights. He even filed a defamation lawsuit against them, claiming their public statements had damaged his reputation. The lawsuit was a blow. The couple had been through so much already, and the thought of another legal battle was exhausting. But they refused to be intimidated. With the support of the nonprofit and their legal team, they decided to fight back. They knew this wasn't just about them, it was about standing up for the tenants they had helped and sending a message that bullying and intimidation wouldn't silence them. The case dragged on for months, draining their time and energy. But the couple used the experience to fuel their advocacy work. They spoke openly about the lawsuit, framing it as an example of the length some landlords would go to avoid accountability. Their honesty resonated with people, and the public rallied behind them. Donations poured in to help cover their legal fees, and messages of support flooded their social media pages. One day, as they were preparing for a deposition, the young woman received a call from Clara. "I've got some news," Clara said, her voice tinged with excitement. The city council just passed the first round of tenant protection reforms. It's not everything we wanted, but it's a huge step forward. And it wouldn't have happened without you too. The couple was stunned. They had been so focused on the lawsuit that they hadn't been following the progress of the legislation as closely as they should have. Hearing that their efforts had made a real difference filled them with a sense of pride and hope. They knew there was still a long way to go, but this was proof that change was possible. The reforms included stricter penalties for landlords who violated housing codes, more funding for housing inspections, and a new program to provide legal assistance to tenants facing eviction. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. And for the couple, it was a reminder of why they were doing this work. The lawsuit eventually went to trial, and the courtroom was packed with supporters. The landlord's lawyer tried to paint the couple as reckless activists, but their legal team countered with evidence of the landlord's history of violations and intimidation tactics. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for fairness, listened carefully to both sides. When it was the couple's turn to testify, they spoke with clarity and conviction. They didn't shy away from the truth, they admitted they had been outspoken, but they also made it clear that everything they had said was backed by evidence and motivated by a desire to help others. Their honesty and sincerity made an impression, and by the end of the trial, it was clear where the judge stood. In her ruling, the judge dismissed the landlord's claims, stating that the couple's statements were protected by free speech and based on factual evidence. She also issued a stern warning to the landlord, reminding him that the courts were not a tool for silencing critics. It was a decisive victory, not just for the couple, but for the broader movement they represented. As they left the courtroom, the couple was surrounded by supporters cheering and applauding. They felt a mix of relief and exhaustion, but also a deep sense of accomplishment. They had faced another legal battle and come out stronger on the other side. And they had sent a clear message: they wouldn't be silenced. The victory gave them a renewed sense of energy and purpose. They threw themselves back into their advocacy work, using their platform to push for even more reforms. They also started working on a new project, a guide for tenants on how to navigate the legal system and stand up for their rights. It was a way to empower others and ensure that no one had to face the same struggles they had. Their work didn't go unnoticed. They were invited to speak at national conferences, where they shared their story and connected with other activists from across the country. They also started receiving offers to write a book or even host a podcast about their experiences. It was overwhelming at times, but they knew it was an opportunity to reach even more people. One evening, as they sat together in their living room, the young man turned to his partner. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asked. "From that courtroom to here, it's kind of amazing, isn't it?" She smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Yeah, it is. And we're just getting started." Their journey had taken them further than they ever imagined, from a courtroom to a movement. They had faced challenges, setbacks, and doubts, but they had also found strength, purpose, and hope. They knew their work was far from over, but they also knew they were ready to keep fighting, not just for themselves, but for everyone who deserved a fair shot at a better life. And as they walked into the future, they felt a sense of determination that would carry them through whatever came next. Their story was still being written, and they were ready to make it one of courage, resilience, and change. The couple's journey had become a beacon of hope for many, but it was also a reminder of how much work still needed to be done. Their victory in the defamation lawsuit and the passage of tenant protection reforms were significant milestones, but they knew these were just steps in a much larger fight for housing justice. They continued to push forward, using their platform to advocate for systemic change and empower others to stand up for their rights. One of their most ambitious projects was the creation of a tenant resource center in their city. The idea came to them after countless conversations with people who had reached out for help but didn't know where to start. They envisioned a place where tenants could access legal advice, attend workshops, and connect with others facing similar struggles. With the support of the nonprofit and a network of volunteers, they began turning that vision into reality. The Resource Center opened its doors 6 months later, in a small but welcoming space downtown. The couple stood at the entrance, greeting the first visitors with smiles and handshakes. It was a proud moment, one that symbolized how far they had come. The center quickly became a hub of activity, with tenants from all walks of life coming in to seek help, share their stories, and learn about their rights. The couple also continued to work on their guide for tenants, which they decided to publish as a free online resource. They spent months researching, writing, and refining the content, making sure it was accessible and easy to understand. When it was finally ready, they launched it with a social media campaign, encouraging people to share it widely. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of people downloaded the guide in the first week, and they received messages from all over the country thanking them for their work. Their advocacy efforts didn't stop at the local level. They began collaborating with national housing rights organizations, lending their voices to campaigns for federal housing reform. They traveled to Washington, D.C., to meet with lawmakers and testify at congressional hearings. It was a surreal experience, standing in the halls of power and speaking to the people who had the ability to shape national policy. But they never lost sight of why they were there, to fight for the millions of people who were struggling to keep a roof over their heads. One of the highlights of their advocacy work came when they were invited to speak at a major housing justice rally in the nation's capital. The event brought together activists, policymakers, and community leaders from across the country, all united by a common goal: to demand bold action on the housing crisis. The couple was scheduled to speak just before the keynote address, and as they stood backstage, they felt a mix of nerves and excitement. When it was their turn, they walked onto the stage hand in hand, greeted by a sea of faces and a wave of applause. The young woman stepped up to the microphone, her voice steady and clear. "We're here today because we believe housing is a human right," she began. "But right now, too many people are being denied that right. Too many people are being pushed out of their homes, forced to live in unsafe conditions, or left with nowhere to go." She went on to share their story, as well as the stories of the people they had met along the way. She talked about the need for bold, systemic change, for stronger tenant protections, more affordable housing, and an end to the practices that allowed landlords to exploit and intimidate tenants. Her words were powerful, and the crowd listened intently, nodding and cheering in agreement. When she finished, the young man stepped up to the microphone. "This isn't just about housing," he said. "It's about justice. It's about dignity. It's about making sure that everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from, has a fair shot at a decent life. And it's about holding people accountable when they abuse their power." Their speech resonated deeply with the crowd, and when they left the stage, they were met with a standing ovation. It was a moment they would never forget, one that reminded them of the power of their voices and the importance of their work. As the rally continued, the couple took a moment to step aside and reflect. They stood together, watching the crowd and listening to the speeches that followed. The young woman turned to her partner, her eyes shining with emotion. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" she asked. "If we hadn't fought back, if we hadn't had each other, where would we be now?" He smiled, squeezing her hand. "I think about it all the time. But I also think about how much stronger we are because of it. We didn't just survive, we fought back. And now we're here, making a difference." She nodded, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Yeah, we are. And we're just getting started." Their journey had taken them further than they ever imagined, from a courtroom to a movement. They had faced challenges, setbacks, and doubts, but they had also found strength, purpose, and hope. They knew their work was far from over, but they also knew they were ready to keep fighting, not just for themselves, but for everyone who deserved a fair shot at a better life. As they walked into the future, they felt a sense of determination that would carry them through whatever came next. Their story was still being written, and they were ready to make it one of courage, resilience, and change. They had started as two people fighting for justice, but they had become part of something much bigger, a movement that was transforming lives and reshaping the world. And with that, they stepped forward, ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. Their journey had taught them the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the strength that comes from fighting together. They were no longer just a couple who had faced injustice, they were advocates, leaders, and changemakers. And they were ready to make a difference.